1987, an American president stood at the Berlin Wall and challenged the Soviet Union to tear it down. For years later, the Soviet Union was gone. Was that a coincidence? Was it the result of a strategy that finally worked? Or was America simply standing in the right place when an empire that was already collapsing finally fell? A speech, a war, an economic crisis, a man on a tank, and finally, a flag lowered for the last time. 5 moments. One empire. And one question historians still debate. Did America destroy the Soviet Union? Or did the Soviet Union destroy itself? By the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan was not looking for a comfortable coexistence with the Soviet Union. He wanted to change the balance of power. His administration expanded support for anti-communist movements around the world, a strategy that became known as the Reagan Doctrine. In Afghanistan, the United States backed forces fighting the Soviet occupation. For Moscow, the war became a long and expensive commitment. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed, billions were spent, and after almost a decade, the Soviet Union left Afghanistan without achieving its original objectives. But Afghanistan was only one part of the pressure. In Poland, the Solidarity movement challenged communist rule. The United States supported the movement politically and materially, while the Polish government struggled to contain it. Then came the military buildup. Reagan dramatically increased American defense spending and pushed the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as Star Wars. To Washington, it demonstrated American technological and military strength. To Moscow, it created another problem. How much would the Soviet Union have to spend to keep up? The Soviet economy was already struggling. Its industrial system was inefficient. Its technology lagged behind the West, and its military commitments stretched across the globe. The American strategy was not simply to defeat the Soviet Union on a battlefield. It was to make the cost of competing with America increasingly difficult to sustain. And if the Soviet system was already under pressure, Washington was willing to push harder. But there is another side to the story. Because the Soviet Union was already in trouble long before Reagan's final years in office. The problem was not simply military spending. It was the system itself. Central planning struggled to keep up with a rapidly changing world. Consumer shortages became a familiar part of everyday life. Productivity lagged. Technology lagged, and the enormous Soviet state was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Then, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary. He did not want to destroy the Soviet Union. He wanted to save it. He introduced perestroika, meaning restructuring, and glasnost, meaning greater openness. But reform created a dangerous paradox. The more people were allowed to speak, the more openly they could criticize the system. Then came Chernobyl. In April 1986, a reactor exploded at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The disaster became more than an environmental and technological catastrophe. It exposed the consequences of secrecy, bureaucracy, and political denial. The Soviet government could no longer hide its failures as easily as it had before, and the cracks were spreading. Across the Soviet republics, nationalist movements became increasingly powerful. In the Baltic states, in Georgia, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. These movements did not suddenly appear because of Ronald Reagan. They had existed for decades, but glasnost gave them something they had rarely possessed before: space to speak. And once people began questioning Moscow's authority, the Soviet Union had a problem far greater than America. It had begun questioning itself. So which story is correct? The American pressure theory or the internal collapse theory? The answer is probably more complicated. External pressure mattered. The arms race mattered. Afghanistan mattered. Western support for anti-communist movements mattered. But none of these things, by themselves, explains the collapse of the Soviet Union. America did not create the nationalist movements inside the Soviet republics. The CIA did not organize the crowds that gathered at the Berlin Wall. Washington did not put Boris Yeltsin on top of that tank in Moscow. And the United States did not write Gorbachev's resignation speech. Those were Soviet and Eastern European events. And that distinction matters. The Cold War was not simply a story of America defeating the Soviet Union. It was also a story of a Soviet system becoming increasingly unable to solve its own problems. By 1989, communist governments across Eastern Europe were falling. The Berlin Wall opened. Poland changed. Hungary changed. Czechoslovakia changed. And Moscow did not send tanks to reverse the process. That decision was crucial. For decades, Soviet power had helped keep Eastern Europe under communist rule. Now Gorbachev was allowing those governments to fall. The Soviet Union was no longer willing to use military force simply to preserve communist governments that were losing control. And once that barrier disappeared, the Soviet Union itself became much harder to hold together. By 1991, the process was irreversible. The Soviet flag came down. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ceased to exist. So perhaps the best answer is not that America destroyed the Soviet Union, and not that America had nothing to do with its collapse. The more accurate answer may be this. America increased the pressure. The Soviet system supplied the weaknesses. And when the pressure met those weaknesses, the structure finally broke. So, did America destroy the Soviet Union? Probably not by itself. But it would also be wrong to say America simply watched from the sidelines. The United States spent decades competing with Moscow, militarily, economically, technologically, and politically. That competition helped create enormous pressure on a system that was already struggling. But the final collapse came from inside, from economic weakness, from political reform, from nationalism, from the loss of control over Eastern Europe, and ultimately from decisions made by people inside the Soviet Union itself. The Cold War did not end with one final battle. It ended when the system that had held the Soviet world together could no longer hold itself together. But while the Soviet Union was collapsing, one communist leader still believed he could resist the tide: Nicolae Ceausescu. But there was a problem. Gorbachev had changed Moscow's policy. The Soviet Union was no longer willing to send tanks to save communist regimes that were losing control. For Ceausescu, that meant something extraordinary. If Romania erupted, he might be on his own. And in December 1989, Romania did erupt. So how did a regime that had survived for decades collapse in just a few days? And what role did Gorbachev and the Soviet Union really play in Ceausescu's downfall? That's the next chapter.